And the next panel, would you please come up? Celinda, Paul, BJ, and Brian.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Bill McCoshen. I get to introduce our moderator today and our host, Jeff Mayers. Before I do that, he said I could give a couple shameless plugs. First, for Capital Consultant, who's excited to be a sponsor of this next panel. Capital Consultants was started by my wife, Carol, back in 1992. Been around for 29 years. I've been at this now for 21 years. Tony Langdell, our Senior Vice President, has been with me for 20. Well-established firm in Madison. Part of what we do, and I think our secret sauce, is we help our clients understand what Ashley just said. Not every question in a poll is equal. Some matter for election outcomes more than others, and that's sort of where we come in and help our clients navigate the ever-changing political environment to make sure they're well-positioned regardless of if Republicans are up or Democrats are up or Republicans are down or Democrats are down. We've been doing this for 5 administrations, and I think we're at the top of our game. So Jeff said I could also give a plug for my partner in crime, Scott Ross. We run a podcast called Win 2020. Scott Ross and I come from very different political perspectives. We didn't need Ellen DeGeneres to tell us it's okay to get along with guys from the other side. We got our start working with Lee Mills, who's here from Channel 15 on an award-winning segment called Unspun. And that's been around for over a decade. So I want to thank Lee and Scott for coming. And now I want to introduce Jeff Mayers. Jeff, as you all know, is one of the fairest guys in town. He is sort of the gold standard. He's our Mike Boucher, so to speak, as far as reporters are concerned, because he plays it down the middle. He asks the tough questions. He's not bashful about doing follow-ups, and he does his job well, which is why WisPolitics is one of the top news sites in Wisconsin and has been for years and years. Prior to that, Jeff was the head Capitol reporter for the Wisconsin State Journal. That's where I first met him. And he is also an author of The Best Golf in Wisconsin. And for those of you, I think the ambassador has golfed with him. Jeff might have the ugliest golf swing you've ever seen, but he gets the ball there. Somehow he gets the ball there. So with that, I want to turn it over to Jeff Mayer.
Don't get into commentaries on golf swings. That's dangerous territory. Talk about polarized opinion. You could upset a lot of people. So thanks, Mac. And that was the best shameless plug I've ever heard. Really. Hey, Scott. Good to see you. Yeah, what's happening? All right. So anyway, I'm wearing a purple shirt today. Well, you have, yeah. So we're in the purple state talking about the purple upper Midwest and what that is going to mean. So I want to welcome our esteemed panelists, and so Celinda Lake, Paul Maslin, Brian Reisinger, and BJ Martino. Please say hello, everybody. So they've arranged themselves D, D, R, R. That one, no mixing of the segregated panel. Okay, so let's just start. We were talking about healthcare. So, and we'll get into this other big issue later. But I mean, how big is healthcare going to play, do you think, in Wisconsin and the upper Midwest going forward? Let's just go down the line here. Go ahead, Celinda, you first.
In the presidential, you mean?
Yes.
I think it's going to be a big issue. I think it's going to be a big issue in the primary because it's really sorting out between candidates who are for Med for All and candidates who are for expansion of ACA. I think and as this race gets down to an older electorate, I think some of the distinctions that Ashley made about the president leading with this will destroy Medicare, I think you'll see that played up more. I thought one of the most interesting, and that was a terrific talk, I thought one of the most interesting stats was she said 67% of the supporters of Med for All think they can keep their private insurance. I'm sure that candidates will want to draw that distinction, and you've already seen that play out. So I think it'll be a big issue. I also think, and she mentioned it, it wasn't the topic of her speech, but obviously the women's reproductive health care is going to be huge, not so much in the Democratic primary, but in the general election, and where for a long time it was not believable to voters that you could have a ban on abortion, etc. some of the laws that have been passed, particularly in Alabama and Georgia and other places, have made that a much more realistic option. So I think if you think of the key target vote here, which is the swing vote is a white, blue-collar, suburban woman voter, she's going to be talking a lot and thinking a lot about health care, because she is the health care voter, and about women's reproductive health care. The last quick note, one of our goals in 2020 has to be to keep married women from voting the same way as their husbands. And we could promote divorce, but I'm not sure that's a great policy for us right now, although we're doing pretty well on it. But when you think about it, healthcare is the one issue that men say the women in their lives tell them what to do. So it's a good issue for us to emphasize because it gives women that independent opinion.
Just to add to what Celinda said, I would just first say, and I agree with everything she said, I would add to it a point that Ashley made earlier. Let's not kid ourselves. The leading element of this election is still going to be Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Up, down, sideways. That's going to be and healthcare is part of the prism that you may view him through. The question I have about healthcare is, and obviously it'll be a little bit different, but a little bit different depending on who the nominee is on the Democratic side. Is after all the attacks happen, and let's just be honest on this panel, I don't think either side is going to have some magical, wonderful healthcare plan that everyone's going to rally. It's going to be a question of what do I dislike more, what they've tried to do or failed to do or still want to do versus what they are trying to do or have failed to do or still want to do. And all those attacks are going to happen. And we've already seen the outlines of it in the previous presentation. At the end of the day, is it still a Democratic issue, which it has been generally, as the one graph showed, with the only exception being the narrow outcome in the previous election, but in every other, or the two elections before, every other election, the Democrat has still been perceived by about double digits as better on health care. So at the end of the day, if you ask, and I'll turn over, we'll ask the two Republicans on this panel, do they want this debate to be largely about health care in 2020? My hunch is that the answer to that would be negative. They'd much rather it be on immigration or the economy, which they kind of failed to make into a big success so far, but they'd rather it be on that ground or other ground rather than a debate about healthcare where Democrats have the advantage. But having said that, there is danger ahead for both sides on this issue. Both sides have vulnerabilities, and so even though Trump may be the leading element of everything about this election, if you then rank all the other issues underneath the sort of rubric of Trump, will healthcare be among, if not the most important? Absolutely.
Okay, you don't have to keep passing the mic. There's two live mics down there. So I want to say something about Brian, who came to my aid here because Sarah Simmons was unable to make it for family reasons. And so, Brian, you have a part responsibility for this whole event happening. So I immediately went to him and said, I need your help. So anyway, Brian, his campaign experience is deep, and a lot of it had to do with Ron Johnson, and Ron Johnson came to the Senate fighting the ACA. So you have some insight into this. How's this issue going to play in 2020?
Well, I should have asked you before I agreed to this if there's a handicap score for the guy that joins the night before. But, so I agree it's going to be probably one of the top three issues depending on how things shake out. I think that a lot of us will probably agree with that up here. The big thing that I think is different about healthcare right now than what we've had in the past, and by the way, it's been, in a way, has been a winning issue for Republicans at times in midterm years and other things. Ron's first election showed that. But the ground on which the healthcare issue has been fought for quite a while has not been good for Republicans, obviously. And the reason for that is that you can't compete with Santa Claus at Christmas. We are constantly in a position of fighting this on their ground where the Democrats are outbidding us in terms of what they're willing to give away. You get to the how do you pay for it and what are the implications of that later, of course. So there's no question that there's traditionally been a disadvantage on this issue. That's not quite where we are now because of Medicare for All. And I know that that name and some of the elements of that stuff are popular, as we saw in the previous slide, or presentation, I should say. But one of the crucial things that I latched onto is actually something that Celinda said here, which was the fact that so many people think that their choice won't be taken away as part of the situation, that the private sector choice won't be taken away. I think that's crucial. I think that speaks to the degree to which the Democrat presidential primary is really hurtling to the left on this issue in a way that goes far beyond what we've seen in any of the previous elections. 2018, I think there's no question that the Democrats showed that it can be a very potent weapon. I think the pre-existing conditions issue was one of the potent things that really changed what happened in our midterm elections here, our governor's race as well as our Senate race. And so there's certainly vulnerabilities for Republicans, but I think that the Democrats are, I guess, mispositioning themselves as the centrifugal force of their relatively far left primary when you judge it compared to most contests I put them in.
Okay, you got most of the code words in there except socialism. All right, so BJ Martino of Terrence, what's your view on this?
Much of the discussion of healthcare over the last few years, when it comes to passing ACA, when it comes to the potential for repeal of ACA replacement, has been about fear for voters. Fear of what I stand to lose if things change. And in the discussion we have right now in the Democratic primary is driving healthcare right now. You can see it among voters, particularly Democrats. It is the most important issue among many Democrats right now because of and driven by that discussion. It's almost like the collective bully pulpit of the Democratic side is making that issue pop for those voters right now. And it is also driving them to the left and driving that discussion of Medicare for all. And while it is a catchphrase, and while it is just 3 words without anything else defining it, all those elements underneath that we saw earlier, it remains at that almost one-to-one positive to negative and is pretty polarized. We can see though as those definitions begin to come out and as Republicans begin to define their opponents as being for what are the things you stand to lose. And rather than writing a check to your private insurance, there's the ad where you're going to cross out private insurance, write IRS, and add a 0 to your check. You're going to lose your private insurance, and you're going to pay more for it. If we get to that sort of simple messaging, that becomes ultimately problematic for any candidate who has hitched their wagon to Medicare for all. Now that said, I'm fine with this being an issue as a Republican among the Democrats during the primary, but when it comes to the general, for many Republicans, it's going to be hit that issue and turn back to the things and the issues on which we will ultimately win. We're not going to ultimately win on the issue of health care, but we can win. We have to address it. We have to hit on it and turn back to issues like jobs in the economy, which we haven't, I agree with Paul, we haven't done a good job of really making that a focus for voters.
And all I would note is, and I'm not naive, none of us are naive about what can happen in a campaign and how information can be disseminated and things can change. But boy, this healthcare discussion that we're hearing from over here is just killing us in the polls right now. I mean, and we're only 10 points ahead of Trump.
Celinda, you want to weigh in on it sounds like the Republicans, they'd be happy to have a draw on health care so they can win on something else. So is it a winning issue for Democrats?
Well, I think it's very strongly a winning issue. I mean, first of all, on the Med for All, there are advantages too. I mean, right now, and the important point that Ashley made is it's completely undefined, and it's a fight for who defines it. And you can define it as socialist medicine. Half of America doesn't know what socialism is, but they're pretty sure they don't like it. Directly correlated with how much Fox you watch. But I would say this, that if you say to people, and particularly if you say to Democratic voters, it's going to guarantee that everyone has access, which does compete for cost in the Democratic primary electorate, that you're not going to have any co-pays and deductibles, and as Ashley said, one of the most popular pieces of ACA has always been no co-pays or deductibles, no out-of-pocket costs for preventive care. If you say to people no pre-existing conditions, which is still a hot button, people are still vigilant. If you say that it will be a way to get prescription drug prices under control, then Medicare for All is a very, very popular policy. If you say it's going to take away your insurance, you're going to double your cost of, and that 0 IRS, that's God help us. That is strong. That is a good argument, DJ. If you let it get defined that way, then obviously it's not popular. But shoot, 4th of July wouldn't be popular if you allowed it to be defined that way either. So I think that one of the things, and Paul was building on this, Democrats, and particularly the women end of the Democratic Party, women candidates, their biggest advantage is on health care. Democrats, their biggest advantage is on health care. So I think people are going, in this back and forth, people are also going to weigh the credibility of the spokesperson. And we're in a lot more robust position on health care than Donald Trump is, who people think's never had to worry about who's going to pay for his health care or his family's health care, and on the health care issue in general. So we'll take that fight. But I think the most important thing, and the last thing I'll say, is health care is an entree to an economic agenda for us. And Democrats must have an economic message. You may not feel, it was funny to hear you say your side hasn't done such a good job. The only thing that makes your side look like they've done a good job is our side. So we have got to have a better economic message, and I think healthcare is a good start on that. We should be using that more as an anchor of our economic message.
All right, well, why don't we just talk about the economy before we move on to the I word here. In Wisconsin, rural voters, small town voters largely went to Trump. A lot of Democrats didn't vote in 2016. Some of them reemerged in 2018. This seems to be Trump's strongest card to play is the robust economy and avoiding recession. So how's that playing? There's some danger signs out there on manufacturing and whatnot, but how's all that going to play in the upper Midwest?
Well, Republicans still are strongly supportive of the president, and those in those rural areas that swung in the 2016 election to the president still very much support his economic agenda in theory. They still very much support the idea of getting China to play fair. The danger lies for us on the Republican side of letting them feel like they're carrying an undue share of the burden.
You mean like farmers and the tariffs?
Absolutely, right. And they are conflicted right now because they do feel that they agree we need to go after China. They haven't been playing fair for years. But why are we shouldering the burden alone? And unless or until we can get that either burden agreed that we're all going to share it more equally or get to some sort of reasonable conclusion on that, there's always going to be that tension going on in those rural voters. They were ready for change. And I did a lot of focus groups. In 2016, I got outside of traditional focus group facilities are all within 10 miles of an airport. So many focus groups are done of voters who live in 20 minutes outside of an airport. And started doing a lot more rural groups, going out with cameras and going to hotel conference rooms out and talking to folks out there. And that's really when you began to get a sense, it was in April of 2016, that President Trump had a chance of winning this. And I heard people say, I know that Hillary Clinton, has been for 20 years, she's the status quo. The status quo hasn't worked for me. I was ready for someone to shake things up. He might start World War III. I had focus groups, but at least there'll be change. They felt like they had been ignored. They had been set aside. So they're still there. They're for this shaking up. But we have to give them a sense of someone and that we have their back during this fight.
And to agree historically, clearly one of the things that happened in 2016 is that, to take Celinda's point, our candidate, it wasn't just a case of they didn't campaign here in Wisconsin and they barely campaigned in Michigan. But, they went all out in Iowa and Ohio and got their ass whipped too. And, the truth is that there wasn't an economic message coming from our nominee in 2016, and our party has been weak in that regard. And there was clearly an anti-status quo, and it wasn't just the economy. We well understand that the nature of the Trump vote was cultural as well, and will still be in 2020. But what the data has showed us consistently for the last 2+ years, it is part of the reason that Tony Evers is now governor, is that there was a very quick movement. By quick, I mean in that first year of the Trump presidency, of blue-collar, and everybody talks about the difficulty that Trump has with college-educated voters and suburban voters and women, and it's absolutely true. But the real decline in his popularity that happened almost instantly in that first year was among more rural and high school-educated white voters, And they now, the truth is, you guys he hasn't sold this economy effectively. And for many of them, to be honest about it, it is a deep systemic problem that dates back a long time, that the, quote, unemployment figures mask, because there's other things going on underneath the surface that are more difficult for people in their lives and economically, and they're going to lash out at whoever they perceive the status quo to be. So the question now is, and we were, by the way, also extraordinarily, what's the right word? We were derelict of duty in letting him off the hook on all of his various scams and frauds and basically non-business record. We just sort of said, oh, he's a successful businessman. We didn't challenge it. I've talked to people who were involved in that campaign. They saw the focus groups say, and good point about focus groups, by the way. You're absolutely right. When you really want to talk to rural people in a place like Wisconsin, you can't just do a focus group in Appleton, because they're not, or Wausau, they're not going to come. And you've got to do an extra effort to go find them. But whatever the Clinton campaign or people associated with the effort in 2016 believed, I think it was, as it turned out, a horrendous mistake to let Trump off the hook for his true economic record and allow him to kind of sail into that slot where anybody who had something that upset them about the economy, well, Donald Trump will solve it. Donald Trump will do something. He's the apprentice. He's a successful guy. Let's go. And we failed in that regard. Now my question is, and it's an open question, his numbers on the economy, he has had a slight advantage on the economy pretty consistently, but it's narrowed recently. And obviously there has been substantial talk. He gets angry about it, but there is substantial discussion about a recession right now, when the real metrics are looked at from people in Wall Street and people who analyze all of this, let alone what a trade war with China might create. So the question now is, he is the status quo. He is the one in charge. Is he still able to go and sell this message? It's very late in the game, and they haven't done a very good job of it. And I say that with, I don't know. And Celinda is absolutely right. We are still have a big question mark associated with our party and our ability to be trusted about the economy. That still has to be resolved in this campaign. So to answer to your basic question, Jeff, this one is very much a ball up in the air. What would seemingly have been a strong Trump advantage really isn't, but it's unclear that it's going to swing to us either. I think it's very much up in the air.
Okay, so Brian, you hail from rural Wisconsin originally, Hill Point. So find that on the map, everybody. So, but anyway, so maybe you have some extra insight into this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, first, I do agree that Wisconsin's going to be a complete jump ball. The state is balancing on a knife's edge. You can see that historically through the last couple of elections, and regardless of what the polls show now, there will be a structural tightening in Wisconsin. There always is every cycle, and that's going to happen here too. So that's something to bear in mind. I guess what I would say about the issue of the economy, which kind of in the last couple minutes has gotten lashed closely what's going on in rural Wisconsin, it's really important to understand the degree of and the depth of the mistake that the Democrat Party has made in terms of the way they've walked away from anywhere that isn't Madison or Milwaukee in the state of Wisconsin. And it's not only, yes, it's individual campaigns and individual messages and individual candidates, of which there have been a lot of problems on the Democrat side in the last several cycles. It's also the cultural shift of the Democrat Party nationally. And that's something that Wisconsin Democrats can't help. And, the occasional good Democrat candidate in a rural area who maybe would have a shot isn't getting help by their national party. So I think that the issue is, on the Republican side, there is a good economic story to tell. It's been told partially, it hasn't been told all the way. We need to tell the rest of it. It needs to be done more effectively. We also have to be able to leverage and hold on to that advantage that we have in rural Wisconsin. When you look at, you talk about the tension that BJ talked about, and I agree with that, there is a tension there. But when you talk to people in Sauk County, where I'm from, or in the northwest in Sean Duffy country, you go out there and you talk to them and they say, the trade war thing, I'm concerned, but I stand with the president. Why? Because they think that, and they see ways that China has been screwing them for 4 decades. And he's the first candidate who's really came in ready to break some China, so to speak, to deal with this issue.
Except the ginseng farmers.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. But they are standing with him from that standpoint. Now, Secretary Perdue last week didn't do anybody any favors. I know conservatives who were in that crowd and were in rural Wisconsin that just weren't only at the Democrat press conference on that issue. And they weren't happy about what he said. But the president, personally, they see him as being really the only person who's willing to shake things up enough to help them and to stick it to China. And I would say that that is tied to 2 things. One is that they see him, keeping his promises, fulfilling his promises on the economy. The other is, that eats at the status quo argument. The idea that the Democrats are not some form of status quo up in northwestern Wisconsin still, I don't think is quite right. I think that Donald Trump is still the person shaking things up in their mind at this point.
Just two quick things though. Barack Obama won northern Wisconsin by a huge margin. That's only 7 years ago. And number two, they may be standing with him, but their numbers are, if you believe, 90%, 95% maybe of the state and national polls. Those numbers standing with Donald Trump right now are about 41, 42%. Last time I checked, I could be wrong about this. Maybe Vladimir Putin would prove me wrong. You don't win an election with 42%. The problem is there is a significant group of people that never liked him, but voted for him. And we all know why, at the end of the game in 2016, who are not in that category. They're not in the, oh boy, I love him and I love the way he stands up. It was a transactional vote, and it's unclear. Can't say for sure that it's not going to go back to him, but unclear if it will. And they are not standing with him on all of these issues. They're standing apart from him, and they're taking a pretty jaundiced eye about where this is all playing out. That still has to be proved. We still have to prove our part of the case. You don't win this thing in some easy cakewalk. It's still going to be very tough. But trust me, the fundamental numbers of Donald Trump have receded to the point that this base everyone talks about. And he feeds the base, and the base is powerful, and isn't this just really tough for the Democrats? I'm sorry, it's 42%, it's 43% at best. And that's a tough road to hoe for them. Not impossible, but tough.
Yeah, I just want to add that, and I love comparing notes, Brian, because I'm from Park County, Montana. I think we have fewer people than you do. So we'll compare. We both know how to walk up behind a cap carefully. The thing, there are Democrats who have understood the rural vote. John Tester. I mean, Barack Obama lost the rural vote overall nationwide only by 8 points. We lost it by 22 points in the last election. You can't lose it by that kind of margin and make up for it enough in the suburban, urban population. But there are Democrats who do better. Tammy Baldwin goes out to rural areas, done a phenomenal job, has a huge gender gap in rural Wisconsin. John Tester, my home state of Montana, lost the rural vote, but really made efforts with the millennial rural voters. And everybody thinks the rural electorate is older, and it is older. But there are a hell of a lot of kids that grew up on the farm or the ranch that would like to stay on the farm and the ranch and raise their kids there and be able to make a decent living, and like renewable energy and like sustainable farming, and et cetera, et cetera. So there are ways that Democrats can and should appeal to the rural vote. The second thing I would say, and I hope Mike will talk about this when he's on the next panel, and Paul just mentioned it, there are a ton of rural voters who disliked both candidates. And in normal circumstances, the people who dislike both candidates would not vote or split their vote. Unfortunately, the people that dislike both candidates voted 17 points to 22 points for...
That's Hillary right now.
Yeah, there you go. 17 to 22 points for Donald Trump. But I'm not sure he can hold on to those voters this time around. And the last thing I would say, it is very important to distinguish in the rural vote between born-again evangelicals, of whom there are a lot, and BJ's a national expert on this, and more secular or mainstream religion, Catholic rural voters. And we don't have a lot of chance with any white born-again evangelical voters, but we have a lot of opportunity with mainstream religious voters who have a lot of problems with Trump's immigration policies, etc. So I think we have to be more surgical here in our rural approach.
Yeah, you know, Mark Green, former congressman in the 8th CD in Green Bay, used to call that the land of the Catholic deer hunter. So that is how he did it. All right, BJ.
I would say, just to put a cap on this, that there is a gap between those who approve of the job that President Trump is doing on the economy right now and those who say they would vote for him in a ballot test, versus an opponent who is not fully defined, and lots of opponents who are potential opponents and are not fully defined. If you look at a lot of the polling in 2015, the Trump-Clinton number on the ballot was, in many ways, the same way. hadn't really fully defined yet. So I think there's opportunity there for the Republican and for the president to work in that space between the economy, and how is he going to do it? By ultimately negatively defining the Democrats' agenda, which is going to be, and defined properly, a completely radical re-engineering of how our U.S. economy works. It is, Medicare for all is, and healthcare is such a gigantic part of our economy that alone, we're going to restructure and re-engineer a gigantic part of our economy. The Green New Deal, which has been obviously been a discussion. Right now, again, said in a few words, sounds good to voters, but once you begin to dig into the specifics that are proposed in there, another radical transformation of our economy. So when defined as, who just does a better job in the economy, but here is a plan on the other side that is going to rewrite the rules of how the American economy works, that's going to give some of those voters in that gap between who approve of the job he's doing and like the direction the economy's headed, but maybe don't like him right now or are not voting for him, give them some room to think and some room to grow into the president's support.
Okay. So Obama won big over McCain in part because of an economic collapse, right? And he got reelected. And then frustrated voters, some of them went to Trump. And I think largely over insecurity or the economy and cultural issues. So can you define the Obama-Trump vote?
Well, there are two different versions, I think. There is a suburban voter that is a Scott Walker voter, clearly, and some of whom leaked to either Hillary or a blank vote in 2016 and still stand apart from Donald Trump. But there's definitely are pieces of that are suburban in nature and probably middle-aged to younger. Not pure millennials. Millennials are very much, very democratic if they vote. There's sort of a break point somewhere around 30, high 20s age group. And think about it, they would either have not voted for Obama or they came of age when Obama was president, and so he sort of became their first introduction to all of this. But anyway, there's that suburban piece that clearly is in play. It's a little more college educated. Then clearly in Wisconsin, there is a group we've just been talking about, which is more rural or small town or small city. They're not all in farm counties, but they could be at least somewhere up in various parts of northern, central, northwestern Wisconsin. They tend not to be college educated. And they tend to be generally probably more likely to be in the middle-age groups. There's a group of very older voters who probably have swung pretty dramatically over to the Trump side, and they're not going to be as easily dissuaded. And there they are. And I would simply say, last thing, I'll let you guys put your spin on it, Celinda. Most of them have backed away from Trump. They either disapprove of his presidency or they're shrugging their shoulders and wondering what comes next. Clearly, and I don't disagree, that there will be an attempt to define whoever the Democratic nominee is in a way, and that's classic incumbent strategy, particularly when you're not Ronald Reagan Morning in America and can just run ads about bears in the woods for people who remember that, and roll your way to a landslide. But when you're in a more difficult position, of course, when you're in a more difficult position, of course you're going to have to define your opponent. There's no question. There are no illusions on this side about that or about the potential way that Trump can get back into this race. But it's fair to say that the voter you just talked about, Jeff, has essentially fairly early on, as I said, it happened largely in the first year of his presidency, and has been unchanged. If you look at that Nate Silver, I think the best sort of Trump approval rating is the one you see on 538, which puts all the polls together, and how constant that has been, with Trump essentially in the low 40s, occasionally under 40, and most he ever gets to is 44 or 45, but basically hanging at 42 or 43 approval with about a 53 disapproval. And understand that there are more, everyone again, talk about the base, I hate to keep coming back to this, but it is a tremendous misnomer that's going on, and has been going on among the news media, both sides, by the way, about this wonderful Trump base. When you simply look at intensity of feeling, it is much stronger on the negative side than the positive side. If you look at strong approved Trump versus strong disapproved Trump, there's been about a 10-point gap. If this is base versus base, we've already won. You know, the negative Trump base is much stronger than the positive Trump base, and has been now for 2 years. But anyway, that group of people that you just talked about, Jeff, they are clearly either negative or unclear and uncertain about what they're going to do in terms of Donald Trump in the election ahead.
I wish you'd be more emphatic, Paul. Anyway.
I was going to say, I'm glad that the vote counts equally for those who will enthusiastically vote for Trump and those who will hold their nose and vote for Trump.
Mitt Romney learned that. You're right about that. They thought Obama was in trouble for that reason, and you're right.
But I think of these Obama Trump voters in a couple different ways, and it's particularly acute here, I think, in Wisconsin, and as well as in a state like Pennsylvania that had a really unique circumstances going on in 2016. You also had U.S. Senate campaigns going on in both of those states, and the problems that Trump has had in the suburbs, and we've seen as the impact of that in many of the suburban congressional seats in 2018. Those seats were beginning to be sown in 2016. And what we saw is traditionally in the polling is that the U.S. Senate campaign was basically providing reverse coattails for President Trump in those suburbs. They were voters in places like Waukesha or in Buck County in Pennsylvania who were turning out and voting for the Republican Senate. That was what was driving them. And they would hold their nose and vote for the president. Meanwhile, the president then went out in those rural areas, those distressed communities, and there was a lot of research done in 2016 by a group mapping out the entire country based on zip code for distressed communities. And it was very clear when I bumped that data up against polling data, distressed communities, and those largely rural that we talk about. So those are the two elements I think that you have. You do have the suburban element, who were partly bootstrapped onto a U.S. Senate campaign and came along for the ride, as well as those rural voters who came out and were more proactively positive towards the president at that time, or perhaps more enthusiastic in terms of their dislike for him.
Okay, Brian, why don't you define the Obama-Trump vote?
Yeah, I think that those categories are right. I think another thing to think about is that we've gotten a chance to see these people through different lenses, right? They're also Walker, Baldwin voters, they're also Johnson voters. So it's a little bit of a kaleidoscope when you get actually into that rural segment, so it can be a little bit tricky. I guess what I would say about this is that one of the defining characteristics that we haven't touched on yet, and I think it's relevant to the question of who the Democrat nominee is going to be in 2020, is the degree to which, yes, the economy I think is going to be a major issue. It's one where Republicans can make a good argument, but there's also that cultural feel in the North. Now, Senator Baldwin is a little bit of a unicorn in the sense that she did a better job of that than most Democrats do, going to northern Wisconsin and kind of diffusing that a little bit. But traditionally speaking, if you take a look at the types of candidates that have done well and what the numbers show, and really just sort of the different forces within the parties, one of the challenges that the Democrats have going into the rural segment of that Obama-Trump voter is that the things that the base here in Madison and that voters in Milwaukee want, the value system there is completely contradictory to the value system up in northern Wisconsin. So people talk about Republicans doing well in rural areas and slipping a little bit in the suburbs, and the Democrats gaining ground there. That stuff's all true. But in Wisconsin, the slippage in the suburbs has been a little bit less pronounced, and the strength of the rural coalition has been a little bit stronger. And I think part of the reason for that is that the Democrats in Wisconsin do have a hard time getting outside of Madison and Milwaukee. When they do, they find that what they're talking about is pretty much 180 degrees from what people up north are talking about.
Yeah, Senator Baldwin was proud to say that she was going after Trump voters at the beginning of her campaign. And, the Made in America Act was one of the sort of hooks that she used for that. But she, in southwestern Wisconsin, she ran 20 points ahead some of the Republican legislative, 20 points ahead. And those Republican legislative candidates still won, So, so something was working for the Baldwin campaign.
And what you guys say, I'm not going to challenge except to say we're not stupid. I live in Madison, but trust me, ever since 2010, and more importantly, probably 2011, when we all went wild about Act 10 and ultimately got our heads handed to us in 2012 and the recall, we get it. We may not succeed, but we get it, that we can't be a Madison, Milwaukee, LA, Washington, DC party here. I mean, we are not stupid. And let me simply say, because I'll just put it on the table here, I mean, if I offend anybody who's got a different candidate that they support, I'm sorry, but I'm just going to be real. There are only two people that are going to win the Democratic nomination for president. I think it's a misnomer to assume automatically that Joe, I won't call him the Trump name, but that Joe is automatically going to be this terrific candidate in blue-collar world, that his story in Wilmington and Scranton, Pennsylvania is enough to automatically succeed, whereas no other Democrat would. He will have certain advantages if he were to be the nominee. I think it's, though, also a mistake to assume that Elizabeth Warren's story of growing up in Oklahoma and of being very working class and living in Texas and trying to figure out what the heck she's going to do in her life isn't going to have resonance as well, and isn't going to be able to cross some cultural barriers that, whether fairly or not, Hillary Clinton desperately could not do in 2016. She had been defined for too long as an insider, as somebody that was part of an apparatus that had lost touch with the American people, and I think you guys are assuming something about, you know, just the way that you might have done with Obama, or, to be dead honest about it, the way we did about Trump, when we all thought, oh, we're going to beat him, no problem, are you kidding me? And we all learned a lesson. So I don't disagree with your acknowledgement that this is going to be a critical issue, and that there is definitely a question mark, but we Democrats are not unaware of the issue, and it's not an automatic that we're going to have a nominee that won't be able to appeal to those voters. Nobody would have ever thought that a lesbian, very liberal person from Madison, Wisconsin could do, you can call her a unicorn all you want. Two different campaigns, she went up there and got people to trust her enough to support her, and that tells me something.
Yeah, I think that, well, I think three things are going on here in terms of the Trump-Obama voters. Most successful incumbents can run on their record. Let's point out, Donald Trump can't. I mean, Paul is right. Donald Trump cannot get reelected on his record. That's why, at historic early levels, he is spending historic amounts of money trying to define Democrats, while they're still legitimately fighting to get the nomination. They're spending huge, huge amounts of money on Biden. They spent it before on Warren. I believe they will be back on Warren, and anybody else who emerges, frankly. His modus operandi and his philosophy of winning is to destroy your opponent so that you become the lesser of two evils. That's what he did. You had a record number of voters, 22%, who disliked both of them on election day, and he will try that game again. And it's really questionable whether you could do that as the incumbent or not, if the public is going to let you escape your record. The second thing, I think, is the major cultural factor I think that Donald Trump won on, because you want to talk about a unicorn, you got a foul-mouthed, cheating, whatever, Russian identified candidate who is running as the lead with born-again Christians because he's promising this and delivering on the Supreme Court transgender policy. So that's a unicorn. It's a very interesting contradiction. And so I think that the character trait that Donald Trump really won on is change. That was the number one character trait that people wanted. 39% of voters said the number one character trait I want is change. It beat being qualified, it beat caring about people like me, it beat being honest, and he won those voters 82%. Now I think all of the Democrats have figured out that you have to be for change. And unfortunately, you have a situation where Hillary Clinton really got backed into, or chose to back into, a corner of the status quo. The last thing I have to say is, particularly when it came to Hillary Clinton, and she had been defined for 30 years in a negative way, but I don't think we can underestimate how difficult it is to elect a woman president. And I do think it's great that we have a variety of women running now, because it really helps. You can't have one view about a woman, because if you don't like a blonde woman, well, you got a brunette. If you don't like a tall one, you got a short one. If you don't like an economic one, you got a justice-oriented one. So I think that helps us a lot. But I think there was there was a record gender gap against Hillary Clinton, and she did better with some groups of women. She won married women, which Barack Obama had not done, but she also really suffered in her margin.
Sounds like Tinder for Democrats right there, it's slipping. I think the thing to remember as we go ahead into 2020 is that it is always easiest to be reelected using the same path that you got elected, meaning that the Trump campaign talks about opening up other avenues for picking up new states. I mean, they pay some lip service to places like Minnesota that they narrowly lost. But the fact is it's going to be very difficult to open up those new avenues that were already open and available to him in 2016. It's going to be largely based on, in many ways, reconstructing the vote that existed in 2016 for him. And it goes back to get really nerd out poli-sci, is VOP's sort of idea of critical elections and what makes media people throw out realignment anytime anyone wins control of anything. But what really means for a realignment to occur is that it has to be a new cleavages and fractures in the electorate. It has to be durable. It has to result in different policy outcomes. And it appears from a couple cycles going through this now that what we saw in 16 wasn't really a realigning election in some way. And so to think we're going to go back to some old way in 2020 of voting it's a possibility, but it definitely appears that this electorate is going to be constructed in a similar way, and the best path that Trump has going forward is to reconstruct and win those states that he had won previously.
All right, let's go to impeachment before we go to audience questions. So, how is impeachment going to play in the upper Midwest with these swing voters?
If any of us can really answer that question, we're lying. I'll only say that that there is danger ahead for both sides. I mean, and we all understand it. And we don't have to be geniuses. You all know the dangers that afflict both sides. I think for a long time, and the reason there's been a lot of sturm and drang about Nancy Pelosi among our base, which now has been resolved finally with her decision to go ahead with this inquiry. There's been a sense on our side that we're holding back and we're being too cautious and we're too afraid of the danger of the vote actually that would have to be cast ultimately here. That somehow akin to the backfire that happened for the Republicans in the Clinton era, that it would all come back and haunt us, and this would be a terrible misstep. And there's still some of that out there. I would only observe that if you really, try to, and it's very hard to try to analyze Donald Trump and his behavior in a logical sense, but if you sort of step back and say, why are they behaving the way they're behaving? I do think at some point, and maybe earlier than we all think, he came to the conclusion that this was not good for him either. And that a drawn-out process of hearings and testimony and revelations from various people close to him and his administration was never going to be a good thing. And that they have now chosen the Stonewall approach because they have essentially decided that that is the least problematic aspect for them if they can hold the Senate. And I think they're probably looking deep down at, they're not worried about the supermajority, the 2/3 vote, but they are worried about enough leakage among the Susan Collinses and the people that are actually up for election in 2020 that he would be embarrassed by a majority vote against him, which I think would still be problematic for him no matter what other outcome we might say. If a majority of the Senate, including some Republicans, voted to impeach him, I can't imagine that's a positive thing for him under any circumstance. So I think there's a cloud and a danger here for both sides. And since this is not Nixon and this is not Clinton, it is happening in an election cycle with a different set of facts and a different media and political environment that we're all dealing with that's dramatically changed. There is no Barry Goldwater, Hugh Scott, John Rhodes, group that's going to trudge up to the White House and say, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, it's over." That's not going to happen. Whatever happens here, it's not going to be that. So we're in a very different dynamic, and I don't think anybody up here could, you guys disagree with me, but I don't see yet, Jeff, how anybody can say that it's going to be plus or minus for either side.
Yes, this is where prediction, I agree, is a fool's errand going forward. I think we can just say where opinion is now, which is that there are a majority of voters who support the idea of an inquiry. And here where questionnaire wording is absolutely essential. So when anytime you see a new poll that says, voters, do you believe this on impeachment? Go look in the article and read the wording of the question. Critically important as voters are parsing this whole thing out. Because if it talks about impeach and remove, that's a different scenario in voters' minds. How you word the question matters greatly. I think going forward, the question is because we are in a cycle, and that changes and could change public opinion so quickly. The point I'm wondering is if the White House has the capacity to prevent this investigation, this inquiry from going to a point when you have a Democratic nominee. At that point, how does public perception begin to change about impeachment? When you have a candidate versus a candidate and an election, which is right now only a year away, but at that point will be 6 months away. Will public opinion say, you know what, it's time. We have a Democratic nominee now. We have an election directly in our sights. Let the voters say. So I think the clock is ticking a lot faster than a lot of folks think. And so that's the White House strategy of just stonewalling and preventing people from going to testify is one that is getting to that point in time.
I wonder whether there's any comparisons to what happened with
I was just going to
the
say,
Walker recall.
I was just going to say that I think Pelosi understands this, and this is not going to be a sword hanging over the head in spring or summer of next year. It'll be however it plays out, it'll be over and done with before that stands at that point. We did learn a lesson. I don't know that we ever would have succeeded, but clearly the more that we went on into Walker's second year, the more that voters started to say in Wisconsin, what are you doing this for? Really? I mean, can't we just vote on this? And that was with still 2 years left to go. So that aspect is still there. I mean, voters know that they're going to ultimately have, but that works both ways. That also works against Trump trying to vindicate himself in some huge way. And say, I told you all along, and there never was any collusion, that none of it, switch that. And there may be a lot of voters who basically look at him and say, I'm sorry, we'll be the judge of this in November. We'll be able to judge it one way or another. Don't try to, make yourself into a saint here. But I think Pelosi is well aware of the fact that she cannot let this go. So if they stonewall, Democrats are going to just simply have to make a decision. Are we going to go with what we got to go with, and is that enough? And let's have a vote. Are we going to add obstruction to it because they're doing something that's pretty unheard of, and in the processes of impeachment, to actually deny anybody having a witness or sending any documents, etc. And then let's have a vote. And then when we have a vote, then it goes to McConnell. And McConnell's already said he's going to go ahead with the trial. I assume he's not going to renege on his word. So I don't think it'll last until April, May, June, July. I just don't.
The other factor about this has to do with something that's not numerical, which is watching the conduct of the House Democrats very specifically. So for one thing, the numbers around this, polling will revert to the mean. There's always a splash. So there's something to be said about that where people should really take with a grain of salt any numbers you're seeing on something that is as high profile, fast moving, and fluid as the impeachment inquiry. But setting that aside, watch the House Democrats very closely. I think that it's fair to say that it is difficult for them to think clearly at times on the president. And if they are in a situation where I think it's easy for there to be distractions on the national level, it's fair to say. And I think that the House Democrats, if they end up putting themselves in a position where they have a process that appears to be a partisan one that was really prejudged the day that the president took office, and people begin to feel that this is reduced down to really just a political process, that's when it does begin to look a little bit more like the lessons that we took away from the recall.
I think a couple other things I would add. I think some of the more interesting questions, I will say this, we have done it, and I don't know about others here, we have just done a bunch of focus groups with swing voters, and I will say this, not once, not in a single group in the last week, did they start out talking about impeachment. They started out talking about healthcare costs and education for their kids and guns and et cetera, the economy, China. I think one of the more dangerous things about this for Democrats is we already were not breaking through on doing anything. And now it's almost impossible for our candidates or our office holders to break through. The second thing, I think it's a very interesting question, and I think it's a landmine for Republicans running for the Senate. They're all trying to bracket this. Voters don't want to bracket, they just want a yes or no, they want an answer, what are you doing? And one of the stronger arguments against these Republicans in the Senate, particularly the ones in more marginal districts, like Arizona, like Maine, like Montana, like Colorado, is to say that the senator voted X% of the time with Donald Trump. People think, wow, I thought Susan Collins was independent. What's she doing voting with Donald Trump all this time? What's she doing voting with anybody all this time? She's supposed to be voting with Maine all this time. And then the last thing I would say is, I think we've talked a lot about persuasion here, but mobilization matters. And mobilization really has mattered historically in Wisconsin. It's one of the reasons I believe we lost the Supreme Court race, one of the reasons we lost the presidential race. It's who gets mobilized, and we should not underestimate impeachment in terms of its ability. And you all are the experts, I defer to you, but the ability to mobilize Donald Trump supporters, both to vote and to give money. I mean, he's basically got an unlimited amount of funding, and every single week he's spending way more than all of our candidates combined on social media. I think that's very, very dangerous. So I don't think there's anything that could have been done except impeachment. I think that Donald Trump is making the best case for impeaching himself. I think that Nancy Pelosi has handled it beautifully, but I think it's fraught with difficulties on both sides.
So fear and anger can mobilize voters, right? So,
Yeah.
okay. Out to the audience with questions.
Can you talk about climate change as an issue and the assumption that it's perhaps only an issue among younger voters?
Yeah, not only, but mostly. And I do think that, and it's, let's be fair, it shows up in a place like Wisconsin, and it will increasingly, unfortunately, because of the reality of the issue, increasingly show up in places that have agricultural economies and depend on the weather and variety of aspects to keep themselves afloat, no pun intended. But it's a bigger issue on the coast. I mean, that's just the reality of the way that the original issue has played out. But my firm's based in California, and it has just risen dramatically. From a third tier to a second tier to now a first tier issue, behind only housing costs, which are, needless to say, are through the roof. Again, no pun intended, in California. It's like number 2. But does it come more among millennials than other groups? Absolutely it does. And that is not necessarily a bad thing for our side, because again, in the whole question of motivation, there are studies and theories out there of the case here in 2020 that says if nothing else, if Democrats are able to turn out millennials at bigger rates than they have before, that could prove the difference in the 2020 cycle. And clearly climate change could be one of the issues that helps to motivate a millennial vote. So, the best answer I can give you.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add on that is it's also a big issue with Democratic primary voters, or a bigger issue with Democratic primary voters. And the Democratic primary is pretty old, actually, the Bernie Sanders effect aside. So you've got all the Democratic candidates committed on very strong climate change plans, and stronger than we've ever had on the Democratic side. I think any Democratic administration will move on this issue pretty aggressively, particularly because I think they will come back to the issue as a turnout issue, and mobilization is going to be very important. Not only is it important for millennials, it's also important for Gen Zers. And the Gen Zers have the potential to make up as much as 9% of the electorate, combined with the millennials, a third of the electorate. And as Paul said, we get that turnout up. I mean, John Tester neutralized his margin in rural areas by appealing to and mobilizing rural millennials. So this strategy reaches deeply into swing electorates as well.
I think for Republicans, it's going to be getting to a discussion about, well, what are your solutions? And the solution that has been put out there is the Green New Deal, which is the one that would cost $93 trillion, would eliminate fossil fuels, and have, again, pretty significant impacts on households' bottom line. You're going to pay more for energy, it's going to be harder to live, and then ultimately, what's the impact? It's a drop in the bucket compared to what China's doing. So are we going to can we as a nation save and prevent climate change? No, but we can certainly soak you dry trying to do so.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to, I certainly think that speaks to the broader issue that the Democrats have on this, which is that for a long time they've spoken kind of effectively about that issue when it's in isolation, but the problem is that for them is that it gets tangled up into their solutions that are devastating economically. And so, the degree to which it's helpful, it's harmful the other way because they are not able to speak about it in an effective way, and that's actually getting worse, to DJ's point. The provisions inside the Green New Deal and just how far left that thing overall is hurtling the party to the left is a real problem. I will say that the question speaks to something that Republicans have to be more serious about, though, which is finding what is our version of those issues for young voters. It's clearly not climate change, but what are those issues where we're going to begin to appeal in a bigger way to the millennial and Gen Z? I think former Governor Scott Walker recognizes this. That's why he's focused on his work with Young Americans Foundation, for instance, being on the cutting edge of how the conservative movement can meet young people where they are. So that's something, it's not the exact subject of your question, but that is something that more broadly Republicans need to figure out.
I'm not predicting this, but if this is an election about climate change and health care, Democrats in the room, please get your inaugural tickets now.
Yeah, I would also say that, the Green New Deal is not known by people either. 50% of people don't know what the Green New Deal is. Again, the strongest correlate of actually knowing what the Green New Deal is how much you watch Fox. So we need to do a better job of defining it. It sounds good to people because like brown old deal, well that's kind of what we got now. So we don't need the brown old deal. Green New Deal sounds better. But if you take the Republican talking points, like we're not going to have hamburgers, you can't fly jets, we're not going to have fossil fuels, then yes, Americans don't like that. If you take the components of the Green New Deal, and it was only a frame to begin with, but if you take the components of significant investment in renewable energy, et cetera, it's very popular. So I think this is a fight to define Green New Deal. And one of the mistakes I think we as Democrats and progressives make is we assume these things are defined and we should just be for them. We head straight into the policy where I think the conservatives are much better. And then, to put the icing on the cake, we head straight into the policy. We use a couple of acronyms that no one can understand. We use facts, and then we give 2 or 3 numbers, and we wonder why we don't win. Where I think the Republicans are much better at framing an issue, talking about values, and then getting to the specifics. And we have to define these policies, but I think we have a lot of opportunity if we do that.
So avoid facts and numbers. That's good advice. Okay.
Well, we got an administration that does that.
I'm kidding. All right, here's a question.
Going back to the 2018 election, it appears that the Democrats were able to persuade the voters that if you are against the Affordable Care Act, then you're against pre-existing conditions. And here in Wisconsin, even though the Republican candidates tried to say that they're for keeping pre-existing conditions, people just didn't believe, or they had too many restrictions on them. I guess the question is, how were they able to do that?
So maybe, Brian, you lived this at helping Scott Walker, so why don't you answer that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that they recognized, because healthcare is more natural to Democrats' wheelhouse, they recognize that there's an empathy issue here. There's a do they care about me type of issue here. They recognized it a little bit more quickly than we did on the Republican side. It was obviously incredibly potent to have that timed with some of the things that were going on with the lawsuit nationally and other things, and they made a very personal, empathetic argument. If you look at some of the ads that were coming over the TV screen and over tablets, there were very compelling personal stories tied specifically to this issue. Now, the flip side is, and it's something that's infuriating for us, and I know, Bob, it was infuriating for you too, it was from the Republican standpoint, it was factually inaccurate. There was a broad record that Republicans could push, specifically in Wisconsin and specifically with Governor Walker, to show that there was an effort to protect pre-existing conditions coverage, and also that the framing of that issue was completely wrong. I think that Republicans were a little bit slow in the uptake of recognizing just how potent that was going to be, candidly. But I think that there were people out there who understood it. I know that when we were out there on the campaign trail, I know that honestly a lot of the grassroots understood it and were pointing to that issue and saying, hey, you need to focus on this, you need to neutralize it. I think that it's right with healthcare, what BJ said earlier, that we need to be able to kind of zap the issue and move on to those things we want to talk about. I think that Republicans thought they'd zapped that issue and hadn't done it well enough in that case, and it was a potent attack. There's no question.
I think the other thing is, and this is where I think I'm really worried about beating Donald Trump, but having said that, I think it's a little easier this time because he has a record. In all honesty, it wasn't just being on top of the issue and smarter about framing it and all of that, which I think we did. Although at the time, it looks brilliant now, but at the time we were framing it on an ACA policy, which an ACA had like 43% favorability at the time. But they had a record of repealing it 49 times. I mean, if you want to keep pre-existing conditions, then you don't repeal it 49 times. And, the public, particularly women, thought, okay, 5 or 10, you may not mean it. 49, you've got a point of view here. So I think that the record counted a lot. And being able to put up these ads with vote after vote after vote after vote to repeal ACA and the pre-existing conditions. If you wanted to have a response, the response would have been to change ACA the way you wanted to change it, not repeal it. And people, particularly women voters, felt like this is just doing away with ACA for the sake of doing away with ACA because Obama did it. You're not caring about what you're doing away with, and you're not offering an alternative, and that's tough.
I'll just add on to that the failure of repeal and replace and all those votes that happened diminished our credibility on the issue nationally.
Yeah.
It just made it harder for anyone at any level of government and as a Republican to advance a positive healthcare message and have voters nod their heads and actually believe the words out of your mouth. Even if it was facts and it had been PolitiFact or in one of those rare instances where PolitiFact actually sides with us, that we were being honest and true, but voters are just like, you had your chance. They saw what happened in Washington and turned the volume off on Republicans with regards to that.
Okay, over here, Mike Tate has a microphone in front of his mouth.
Thanks. Some people are used to be scared of that. But my question is, how much do you think there is a potential lie factor in people just simply saying they're not going to vote for President Trump? And also, in terms of, we saw a historic undervote in the 2016 election, how many people that didn't cast a vote, particularly in something like Waukesha County in 2016, because they were disgusted by Trump, but now say, oh, I like the tax cuts, or like this. How much are we undercounting potentially Trump's support? I asked Professor Franklin this question at his last poll. It's like, he shows, Trump down to potential Democrats, but if you add up the people who choose not to answer, or who claim to not have an opinion at that point, it gets pretty darn close to 50-50. So is there a lie factor, and do we think people that blanked him the first time are Republicans come back?
I'll answer that a couple of ways, and I don't want to seem too facetious here, but I'd be more worried about the count being affected by the fact that the Senate Intelligence Committee, run by a Republican, has reported to all of us that the Russians hacked into 50 different state election systems. I'm not kidding. I'd be more worried about the count from that standpoint than I would about actual voters either showing up or not showing up. From the standpoint of this question, I don't believe the lie factor is there. I think if there's anything that's been true about Donald Trump and his supporters and the ongoing reinforcement they get from a variety of conservative media outlets, not just Fox, they're pretty brash and open about how they feel. So I don't think there's an undercount going on. I do think that, or underreporting in polls, I do think that there is some conservative reluctance to even take a poll. And that is something that we all had to kind of learn and correct for and have to think about. I do think there was some undersampling of high school educated voters in the state polls, not the national polls so much, which were, after all, pretty accurate, other than the one that claimed that USC, that they were the most accurate, where it was actually the most wrong. But I think the state polls, there was a question of sampling, and I think it's something that, you know, again, we always look in the rearview mirror, and you wonder if you're going to be, you know, I think there may be an under-polling of millennials this time, because people just don't perceive that the turnout might rise as much as it will, because it clearly did in the 2018 cycle. So I do think that's an aspect, and I think your last point, Mike, is actually perhaps the one the most germane. If I were, I don't want to be, but if I were putting a Trump hat on and saying, how are we going to win Wisconsin, I would not go exclusively to the north. I would absolutely say, is there some mechanism by which we can get some of those Walker suburbanites back, who clearly, whether it was the Access Hollywood, or whether it was his general demeanor, or who knows what it was, clearly were reluctant to vote for him in 2016 and either blanked or went for Gary Johnson or whatever. And so I do think it may only be 30, 40, 50,000 votes, but 30, 40, 50,000 votes, as we've all seen, can decide a Wisconsin election. So I think that last part is the one, as a Democrat, I would be worried more about, that you guys would figure out a way to get some of these suburbanites back. But I don't think the Trump voter lies or is any way reluctant to say that they're for Trump.
I'll let BJ address some of the specifics of what he's seen when they've been out there trying to capture some of these people in their polling. What I will say is that I agree that if it's there, it's a small factor. And I think it's smaller than a couple of other factors that are relevant to your question that are really, really important. One thing to remember is that, yes, Republicans do need to do better in those suburbs, and they do have the ability to. It's important to note that the raw vote in Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington counties didn't slip. So there's this idea that, like, oh, a bunch of them stayed home or whatever happened. The raw vote, the vote share from 2014 to 2018 in the gubernatorial races held. What happened is that there have been some migration changes in terms of the demographics in those areas, and there was a liberal turnout time bomb that went off in Dane County, in Milwaukee, but also, you know, along with that, there were more liberal voters who came out in the wild counties, which isn't something we associate with liberal voters, but that happened. So the Walker raw vote was there, margin slipped a little bit. This is where mobilization comes in, and this is where I think actually one of the big final cards to play that Republicans have in the state in 2020, which is the conservative grassroots. It's storied, it's strong. The recall Ron Johnson's election in 2010, again in 2016, Brian Hagedorn in April 2019, time and time again, the national media and the national groups and the entire narrative turns against Republicans, and Republicans win. How? There's a lot of factors, but the crucial one that's always there is the conservative grassroots in this state. Now, what are we doing about it here? You take a look at what's happening with the Republican Party of Wisconsin, Trump victory, RNC. They are ahead now of where they were in 2016 with the field operation. That's on top of strong operation that's already there that exists in the local county parties, the conservative grassroots that's there. Ron Johnson calls it the conservative grassroots juggernaut. And it truly is there. It is a massive force in these elections, and I think it's part of a broader conservative infrastructure that exists in Wisconsin that I'm not sure exists on the liberal side right now. And I think that matters in 2020.
And I'll just add to the point about sort of respondents lying, and everyone was concerned about the composition of some of these samples in states. I also don't think it would be fair to judge any pollster from 2016 who was in the field even 2 weeks out from the election day. We saw Wisconsin move over the course of October, but it broke very late. And in Pennsylvania, it was Wednesday before the election when I got data out with Trump up 1 point in that state. And my partners couldn't believe me. They asked me what was wrong with my data, because we had never seen a poll in Pennsylvania with him up until that last week. And so to judge these people who are sitting on their hands, I think there was not only late-breaking decision-making, but late decision about I'm coming up. Field operations are really kicking into their highest point at that point. Voters are energizing everything that was happening in terms of the Comey letter. In that week, we're coming to fruition. And it's, you know, if you thought that was crazy, then 2020 is going to be, you know, a wild ride. So we're going to see a lot of the same.
And there is a flip side of it, to argue their point for once. Obama, it was true that the field operation of Barack Obama in 2012 was extraordinary. And it did fool the Romney campaign. They thought, because of the intensity of support, and the gap was nowhere near what it is now, but that there were plenty of Obama voters who were kind of like, okay, I'm probably for it. But the Obama folks knew exactly how to get them out in the states that mattered, and clearly Trump 2020 is going to attempt to, they know what their states are, they're Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida, first and foremost, those four, and maybe 2 or 3 others. They are going to try to attempt and replicate from their standpoint that effort, and Democrats should be wary about that. You're absolutely right about that.
All right, let's check. Oh, go ahead, Celinda.
Let me just add 2 quick things. I have a slightly different view about the secret Trump vote in the sense that I think it exists, but I think it exists more by who responds to polls than, and Paul was alluding to this point, than people lying when they get on. I think what people do is just exit. And you got to realize that our response rates now are 2 to 6%. So one of the hardest things is to get people on the polls. And I think one of the things that really convinced me of this is that Trump did better in online polls than he did in phone polls. And in fact, because of the upward bias of online polls, you would think he would have done worse. So I do think that the anonymity of online polls, some conservatives stayed on that didn't stay on phone polls, especially if they were talking to a woman interviewer. And we analyze everything now by people, what the gender of the interviewer that they're talking to, also the race of the interviewer that they're talking to. And people think they can guess the race of the interviewer in 45 seconds, and they're 85% right. So this is a huge factor in terms of phone banks. A second thing I think is, I think Democrats and progressives, I do believe in the conservative juggernaut. I also think, and I say this as someone who was born in a family of faith, you got God and Jesus telling your people to vote every Wednesday and Sunday? We don't have infrastructure like that, except maybe in the African American community. I mean, that's formidable. And we are way too dismissive of this. It doesn't look like, we don't see the GOTV out there in August like we're out there, so we say in Michigan they don't have any GOTV. Well, yeah, they have GOTV. They just doesn't look like ours, so we're dismissive of it. So I think we should be much, much more respectful of the way that the Republicans and conservatives turn out their vote. I would also say, and I think we're all waiting with breath held for the Louisiana, Mississippi, and Kentucky votes, because I think this will be a real indicator of whether impeachment is mobilizing on their side. Are we in a runoff in Louisiana, or were we able to avoid it? What happens in Mississippi where we should have been ahead? Kentucky's closing very fast, and Bevin is a very flawed governor, and yet, we've seen that turn out before. So I think that these early races could be a real eye-opener for us on what their turnout is really going to look like, and we need both persuasion and turnout on steroids.
But having said that, 3 million people in Wisconsin, and I think it's going to be even higher. I just don't think anybody is going to pass this one up. I think
it's going to be a lot.
I think we're looking at the record turnout of all record turnouts, the mother of all turnouts next November, and so in a way, if it's clean, then whatever result happens, that's our democracy. If everybody participates, or not everybody, but at least higher numbers than we've ever seen before, and I think that's what's going to happen in November 2020, then let the better side win.
Okay, we got a couple more questions here. Go ahead, Lee.
I know I do. Is it okay if I hold it? Okay. Hi, Lee Mills from NBC 15. Not a question that I'm using for publication, just more for curiosity purposes, and it was a perfect segue with you talking about massive turnout heading into 2020. So if we look at the kind of 3 biggest generations of our voting population right now, and I'm going to just say this so that you guys know where I'm coming from. If we look in 20-year increments, so we have baby boomers, X, and let's just say Y, or millennials, there are 9 million more people born in 85 to 2004 than baby boomers. I mean, it is a huge generation. So when you look at that, and one of you at least specifically said that this younger group of people tends overwhelmingly to vote democratically. I spoke with a demographer before the 2016 campaign, and at that time, he made the prediction a Republican will never be able to win because of these population numbers, and he was wrong. So I would be interested in your take on what happened in 2016, and knowing that we now have 4 more years of this younger generation, what do either Democrats need to do to rally that base, because it's huge, or what do Republicans need to do to combat what is a very young and energetic group?
I'm going to go real quick. Number one, Hillary Clinton won 3 million more votes. No one should forget that. Okay? They didn't occur in the right places, in the right states, in the right dimension, because we have an electoral college. But that was part of the dynamic which is continuing, and it is affecting the current poll. Number two, much, not all, but much of the millennial piece of attitudes is correlated with ethnicity and race. And there are, particularly in the Latino community, that is a disproportionately younger electorate. Unfortunately for us here in Wisconsin, to a lesser extent in Michigan and Pennsylvania, their numbers aren't as great. I can vouch for the fact that in the 8th district in 2016, in Green Bay and the Fox Valley, millennials were supporting Donald Trump and Ron Johnson and Gallagher, their candidate for Congress. So it doesn't follow automatically that because the national numbers are better for Democrats among millennials, which is true, that it's going to play out that way in every single state. A big battleground will be millennial and Z in terms of whites voters in Wisconsin and where they actually are and who turns them out. And I think it's a closer call here than it will be nationally. The final point is maybe the most profound, if you can accept that. Why are the Republicans sticking with Trump as long as they are? Even though, I should say Jeff Flake is half right when he says if it were a secret vote, most of my colleagues would send him out in a second, and I believe that's true. I think they have concluded that part of the whole dynamic, Kathy Kramer put her finger on it, you guys in a way have alluded to, is that there is a reaction going on to a cultural and demographic change in this country that is obvious. I think it's probably an endgame reaction. In other words, sheer demographics would tell you that older, less educated voters are going to leave, I hate to say that euphemism, when you're over 60, but they're going to leave the electorate ultimately. And they're going to be replaced by younger people. By the way, in the 80s, the younger people were voting for Reagan. It scared us to death. And it took us a while to get out from under that, because they came of age and they liked Ronald Reagan and they felt positively about the country and they were voting Republican. And now it's very different. And part of the reaction is a part of our, and it was strong enough in the right dynamics to get this guy across the finish line in a few states and win the presidential election in 2016. No question about that. But it was clearly a counter-reaction to a reality, a demographic reality that isn't going to change. I believe that the Republicans in Washington at the national level have decided that the least problematic solution for them is to stick with this guy and keep their party united for the aftermath. We're talking so much about 2020. I believe the Democrats are going to win in 2020. I believe 2022 could be an absolute reversal based on everything we know. Who knows? We could have our heads handed to us. We could lose the governorship in Wisconsin. We could lose the Congress, because that's the way our politics works. These guys want to be there to fight, Trump or no Trump. And to abandon Trump, I think, risks so much of a bloodbath within their own party and within their sort of creaking structure that is diminished. It isn't some realignment on their behalf. No, it's a rearguard action against the direction of the country. And they're struggling with it. You see it on an issue like immigration. You see it on a number of other aspects of our politics. And I think, quite understandably and logically, Republicans in Washington, in the Senate, have determined, let's stick with this and play it out, because that's less problematic than if we are to basically split the whole thing asunder right now, and then what are we left with? But they are very aware of the demographics of the country and the direction you just talked about. And while it may still have not been good enough, and might have actually worked against us to some extent in 2016, I guarantee you, unless this changes, if you guys lose the Latino vote and the Asian vote, people don't talk about Asian Americans, they have moved more dramatically to the Democrats than Hispanics have in the last 20 years because of these policies of the Republicans on immigration. It's a killer. How did Democrats win 7 congressional seats in California? I mean, Trump can joke all he wants about California, how it shouldn't be part of the American, he needs it for the economy though, it's the 5th largest economy in the world. They're down to 7 or 8, is it? I think it's 45 to 8 right now, congressional seats in California, which is unbelievable. California used to be Republican under Ronald Reagan. Part of that are Asians that have moved dramatically against the Republican Party. You take millennials, Latinos, Asians, line them up, and say every one of those people are going to become more important in this electorate, not less important, and you guys have lost them for a generation. If that were be true, you're dead. So anyway, it's a very good question on your part, and it is still, I think, haunting their party. and they're scrambling to figure out, and we're trying to say, okay, this is not a guarantee that we win, but goddamn, we're stupid if we can't win with the way this dynamic is now working.
Here's your headline.
I'll just say, the emerging Democratic majority has been emerging for the last 30 years. You know, have been those who've written books about it, right, for many years ago, that this was an inevitable result of demographic change. But we have a two-party system, and the parties change, and the parties take on new things. So to say that this is going to be inevitable at this point, there's some sort of tipping point where we have Democratic majorities as far as the eye can see, is just not how we're built as a country in a two-party system. I would say to your question about the increased turnout in the last election, turnout is very much a curve from the oldest voters down to the youngest. And what we saw was that curve grew across the board. Older voters came out at higher numbers as well. It got a little flatter, but older voters came out in even higher numbers than they had before. So part of that wasn't just a shift where it came up and the younger voters came up. It was an overall raising of the tide and a slight flattening of that curve.
Yeah, I want to say that I think that, and I was a teenage Republican, my family's all Republican, which is in my party like saying you were a teenage werewolf. But for a minority party that's on its death legs, they've had the presidency for 12 of the last 20 years. They have majority of the governors, they have majority of the Senate, we're not likely to take it back. They were 750 legislative seats still behind where we were when Barack Obama started. I mean, God, you guys are doing bad. I wish we could do as bad as you were doing. So I think demographic changes are really important, but I don't think they're going to produce the kinds of wins we want in 7 months. They're going to produce the kinds of wins we want in, in 10 or 20 years. In terms specifically of millennials, there are 3 issues. First of all, we should remember millennials are voting very Democratic right now, but they voted, white millennials voted 1 point for Donald Trump in 2016. So this is a battleground, and I take very seriously these efforts, and Scott Walker is a very formidable leader of these efforts. And I assume, just from past history, he's working with both of you two, very formidable folks in terms of targeting millennial voters, non-college millennials, for example, in particular. Secondly, we got to do mobilization of millennials and Gen Zers. Right now, their turnout rates are still massively under the older voters. And thirdly, we have to do registration. And our party still has a fight about registration. Does registration work? And of course, in Wisconsin, you got same day. But in other places, I went into a meeting of funders that will go, I won't tell you who they were, but I have my whole presentation on millennials and registration. They said, we just want you to let you know that we don't believe in registration. And Teresa will love this. And I said, oh, fantastic. Okay, cool. So here's the deal. 40% of millennials in 2020 will not live where they lived in 2016. So if you think we can win without 40% of millennials, don't register a soul. Good strategy. Unmarried women voters under 55, one of our biggest blocks. A third of them do not live where they lived. In 2020, a third of them do not live where they lived in 2016. Don't register them, go for it. If you can win without millennials and unmarried voters, then you got a strategy. But if you think we might need those voters, you got to believe in registration. And we ought to be having far more infrastructure today than we have. It's not a question of what we have October 15th. It's a question of 2020. It's a question of what we have October 15th of 2019. So I think there are some very serious challenges in maximizing the demographic advantages we have, and I hope our side gets it.
The only other thing I'd say is that a lot of those predictions about the demise of one party or another, and it's usually the Republican Party that prediction focuses on, is that assumes that the electorate is both monolithic and static when you get into all of these different groups, and it's just not. You can see that in terms of, as was referenced, the young vote and what happened in 2016 with Gallagher and Johnson and Trump. It's also true of Scott Walker's inroads with the young vote in elections that were not that long ago. It also gets back to mobilization, as you said just a moment ago. And all of those things are much more fluid than people think. If I had a dime for every time that someone told me it was impossible mathematically for Ron Johnson to win in 2016, I could have quit and I wouldn't have had to worry about it. And it's just the nature of things that it's fluid. So it's something to remember.
Okay, we're up against the clock. There's some more questions here, but you can address them individually to the panelists. We're going to take a half-hour break. There's some cookies and coffee there, and you can network and look at your phones and all that jazz. I want to thank Capital Consultants for sponsoring this section, and thanks to our panel, Celinda Lake, Paul Maslin, Brian Reisinger, and DJ Martino. Thanks very much.